Good evening and welcome back to the first newly recorded Bible Speaks in the year of 2017. For those of you who watch on a regular basis, you'll notice that the first part of January, which is when we're recording, was filled with a couple of replacement programs because of obviously the holidays and then getting started again in the new year. I don't know whether it's the same for you as it has been for us here, but it seems like this year was slow to get started. Normally, the first of the year, everybody's gung-ho out there, everything's new, and we clean the studio, which hasn't happened yet. There's other things like that. But for some reason or other, maybe it was all the political things going on in the background that's kept people's minds away. Anyway, we're back. We're going to start this year with a series entitled, if you read the titles there, in this case it's Who Are the Hittites, but basically we're going to ask who are the various people in the Bible. I mean, we have, besides the Hittites, we have the Canaanites, we've heard of them, and the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Kenites, and there's a few others as well. So who were all these people? They're mentioned many times in the various parts of the Old Testament and sometimes in the New Testament too. But, who were all these people? One thing I want to stress before we go into it in any great detail is that where the Bible refers to all these other people, Canaanites and this sort of thing, you have to remember they're referring to tribes. They're not talking about countries. Israel wasn't a nation back in the days of the Exodus and the beginnings of the conquering of Canaan. They were tribes. The Israelite group that came off the desert was a nomadic tribe, a big one, obviously, but simply that. It didn't have a land it came from, if you will. And some people get confused and they wonder about how all these different tribes or different races can be living in the same small area as we know Israel to be today, and yet, of course, they weren't all over. They were in their different tribal regions. Some of them were nomadic, came in off the desert for a few months and went back again. So it's kind of interesting. You read your Bible and you hear them referred to. I mean, who's the very famous Hittite? You all know him. The husband of Bathsheba, who was sent off to get killed in battle so that David could have his way. I mean, he was a Hittite still living in amongst the Israelites. So, where'd they come from? So, who were, as it says in the title here, who were the Hittites? And it's not quite as simple as you might think. As always, when you start doing this sort of research, what seems to be a simple, they were a bunch of people who lived in the same area as the Israelites. Not quite so. There's lots of evidence for archaeology, of course, and for these programs we do depend a lot on archaeology and Bible archaeology, but there's also the Bible texts as well, and we use those. And sometimes, as you've probably noticed in listening to this program, they don't always agree. In fact, they quite often disagree. Okay. As I said, I made a quick note here that the two sources of information aren't really compatible. If you were watching the Smithsonian channel, I think it was, a few weeks ago, of course everybody watches the Smithsonian channel, but if you were, they did a 2-hour program, I think it was, which for the Smithsonian is a long program, about the Hittites. Nothing to do with Bible study or anything else, but just who they were. I'd already written this script at that time in the interest of self-disclosure, but I obviously watched the program with some interest because it added a lot of information to that which I'd already gleaned. Okay? And there's a certain element of mystery to the Hittites too. I'll explain as I go on. So let's look at the Hittites from the point of archaeology, first of all. Okay? About 1900 BC, so we're looking at a fair way back. Okay, but 1900 BC, some Indo-European, that's a mixture of Asian and European people, if you will, groups of people, began to settle in an area which is now what we call Turkey. Or if you can imagine the map, I don't have one behind me today, unfortunately, but if you imagine the map, okay? And they gradually, this group got, you know, bigger and bigger as people moved into the area. And if you remember that back in those times, if one group got powerful or prosperous, people from other areas came to them for security, for safety, for being able to get fed. And so kingdoms grew, flourished, and died quite rapidly. By the 16th century BC, so 400 years later, that they were powerful enough, a nation, if you will, to invade Babylon. And this is long before Babylon became, you know, like the time of Nebuchadnezzar and that sort of time. But they invaded Babylon, which wasn't that far away, okay? And they continued to expand until at one point in the about 1400 BC, around that time, 1400 BC, they were what we now call a superpower. They were the biggest thing in that area. And they weren't the only thing in that area, but they were certainly very big. And they were on a level, if you will, with Egypt or Assyria, which were the other two big powers in the things. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that the relationship between the Hittites and Egypt was very volatile, very fractious. I guess their border was bordering on the lands that Egypt felt they were responsible for. But anyway, what they did, they eventually accumulated, or whatever the word is, came to a point where there was this huge battle at the Battle of Kadesh. Now you hear that mentioned more than once in the Bible. You hear it mentioned in history books and this sort of thing. The Battle of Kadesh was a turning point, because at that battle, because neither side could achieve a superiority. I mean, in those days, you worked out who killed the most people, and whoever lost the most people lost. But in this particular case, it was a stalemate. And so what they did, and what we have literally copies of today, which is amazing when you think about it, was they signed what was the world's oldest peace treaty. Okay, now it was done in cuneiform on tablets and survives today. One of the things about the Hittites is that we know so much about them, and I'll talk about it a little later on, but we have thousands upon thousands of records from their capital city with all the, you know, the diplomatic goings on, this sort of thing, including, as I say, this treaty. So we have a lot of factual history about it. It's not just looking at a few rocks and thinking, well, somebody must have been here, you know. Anyway, in fact, as a point of sideline, if you will, digressing, the Hittite writing, although at the time it was cuneiform, which is, you know, the old, looks like chicken feet at different angles stamped into clay. It's actually made with a tool which you make a mark which is thick at one end and thin at the other, and depending on which way the mark goes and how many there are is the word. But that is what our writing today is based on. Back before the Arab writing, way back before then, they came up with the art of writing, if you will. Okay? The Hittite capital, which was called Hattusha, is being excavated. I'm sure it was evacuated a few times too, but it's been excavated very, very carefully, and it's huge. I mean, it reveals a very formidable and a religious empire. Nothing to do with Christianity. I mean, they worshipped all sorts of gods. In fact, they seem to as they conquered different lands and things like that, they seem to have absorbed all the different gods from the different lands into their own religion. So they ended up with, a city with idols to different gods all over the place. There is evidence that at some point in time, around the 12th century BC, that Hattusa was invaded and burnt, because some of the excavation obviously shows signs of the city being torched, but the records were still intact. But it seems like that the city had been largely not abandoned so much as people had drifted away from it, which is why it was so easy to be attacked. Because if you go on the internet and look up the city of Hattusa, which you can do, of course, it was a very formidable city. I mean, it was really hard to attack it. It was built on top of a hill with other hills around it, and then huge walls around it, and then walls within inside that. So it would have been if it had been fully manned and fully occupied, I doubt if anyone could have taken it. But as it was gradually, people moved away, it became more and more easy. Okay. Now, there were obviously a number of invasions of the Hittites. They were obviously a prime target. Assyria would like to have their lands and tried many times. Egypt, of course, was always at their heels. And they survived very well, but they had a kind of their reigning family, if you will, was like father to son to the uncle, this sort of thing. And then towards the decline of the empire, various family members took it upon themselves to depose the one that was in and put themselves in, and very gradually, of course, the whole thing fell apart. But for the 14th century onwards to the 12th, it's like although they were spread all over that area, all the way down right up to Egypt and all the way into Syria, what is now Syria, and all over Turkey, what is now Turkey, very gradually the central city, the control, seemed to have been diminished, which is of course why it was open for invasion. In Karshemish, which is in northern Syria, which is a great place of archaeology and excavating. They were excavating there before the First World War, and in fact they've been doing it ever since then. I think there's still people digging in Karshemish right now, looking for something. But Karshemish was made what they called a vice-regal, in other words, a second capital, a bit lower in status than Hattusa. And as they began abandoning, as it seems, they moved out of the land of Hatti. They called it Hatti, not Hittite, but Hatti. As soon as they started moving south, maybe the weather got bad, or I don't know. But anyway, there was a sort of a regional decline at the end of the 12th century. And it looks like a lot of them came to the Karshemish area because there are a lot of pottery and again, they brought their writing and their tablets and their history with them. Okay? And so we think that a lot of them fled to that location and then spread out all over the place. Now, there's a lot of history about the Hittites. I've only skimmed over it because this is, after all, a Bible program and not a history program. But they are, very few people seem to have heard of them. Everybody knows about the Romans and the Greeks and the Syrians, and we know about Babylon because Babylon is in the Bible much more. But the Hittites were there first. And they were still around at the time of the great Israelite conquest of the land. So they're part of the background. So when you read about a Hittite being mentioned or by name, so and so was a Hittite, this sort of thing, in biblical text, they're not some stray tribesmen who wandered in off the desert. They were part of a huge and very cultured, if pagan, but very cultured nation. Now, that was archaeology. Now, who are the Hittites according to the Bible? And here's where we run into our differences. Surprisingly enough, or perhaps unsurprisingly, I don't know, the Hittites play a prominent role at key places in our Hebrew Bible, in our Old Testament. Ephron the Hittite. Do you know who he was? Of course you do. Ephron the Hittite. Everyone knew him, right? Well, Ephron the Hittite sold Abraham his family burial ground, if you look in Genesis 23. Okay? Esau, remember Esau? Jacob and Esau? Esau married a Hittite woman. And Rebekah despised them. All in Genesis 26 through 34. So, at the time of the fathers of Israel, Jacob and Joseph and all those people, the Hittites were still living in the area and still obviously intermingling with the Israelites in their nomadic stage before the Egyptian era. And Esau married a Hittite. Now Esau is considered to be, by a lot of scholars, the beginning of what we call the Arab nations. Okay, we'll come into him later. Frequently in the Bible, if you read Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, you will see they are listed as one of the inhabitants of Canaan. Canaan being what we call Israel today. So, they weren't, whereas they may have moved from this huge empire that they used to have, they're still a pretty dominant force in the area that the Israelites are going to move into. As I said earlier, King David had Uriah, the Hittite, okay, killed, or put him in harm's way, shall we say, so he could acquire his wife, 2 Samuel, okay. King Solomon had Hittites among his many wives. Don't believe me? 1 Kings 10, 2 Chronicles 1. Says it there, plain and simple. So they're around, they're an influence on Israelites. And the prophet Ezekiel, when he does his denigrating Israel for being weak and falling away, does it with the metaphor, if you will, using a Hittite mother in Ezekiel 16 to make the point. So the impression is that as I said, many Hittites living in the land of Canaan during the time of the founding fathers. Okay, they were in all over the place. They weren't just in one particular area. Like, as we'll find out later on this year, some of the tribes lived in certain areas, and you only come across them when the events happened in that area. And this impression I have anyway of them being all over the place was reinforced by the many biblical references to Hittites during the times of the kingdoms after the split, during the times of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But that still leaves us with a bit of an open question regarding references to the Hittites during the time of the patriarchs. I mean, to a certain extent, the history composition of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, kind of leans towards that. If you were to assume that the narratives there were historical realities written at the time, close to the occurrence, close to the occurrence, then one might conclude that the references to the original Hittites, okay, and I think what happened was that the Hittites who left the empire, shall we say, and drifted south and became into Canaan, that sort of thing, we're going to refer to as the Neo-Hittites, the new Hittites, if you will, descendants of, okay? But we say that because most scholars believe that the narratives from the composition history of the Pentateuch, the narratives in there were actually written down or composed hundreds of years after the events they describe, and often, as will happen when you do that, contain anachronisms as to the dates and peoples, and they're superimposed on current time. So we're assuming then that when the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, refers to Hittites, it's Neo-Hittites, new Hittites, if you will, descendants of. I mean, the older Hittites never called themselves Hittites, surprisingly enough. They weren't known as the Hittites at the time, you know what I mean, at the general time. I mean, they called their language Nesite, and they called their land Hittite. So referring to themselves as the people of Hatti, okay? I mean, to be honest, if scholars had known from the beginning of the research what we subsequently know now, hindsight being wonderful, they would never have been called, they would probably been called Nessites or been Nessians. Obviously, the biblical scholars referred to them as what they knew them as, okay? But when the once mighty kingdom collapsed, those Hittites, if you will, that lived in what was the Syrian vassal states, in other words, the states that the Hittites, I'll keep calling them the Hittites, ruled in Syria, they continued to keep the culture alive and became what, as I say, scholars call the Neo-Hittites. The archaeology, and this is where we get the problem, the archaeological record reveals the story of the original Hittites, okay, the original empire, whereas the biblical story tends to refer mostly to the Neo or the New Hittites. Okay, so there's the Hittites. They are a European, Neo-Indo-European tribe who became an empire and amassed various vassal states and various holdings around Israel, around that area, and who were living there at the time of the patriarchs. Now, if you remember, if you cast your mind back and remember that one of the instructions that Joshua was given was to go into the land and get rid of everybody. And scholars for a long time have had some problems with that. It's fairly obvious that however the Israelites moved into Israel, into Canaan, whether they came off the desert in a very short space of time and just simply became a marauding army that went through, or whether, as many scholars tend to believe, it was a gradual process where they gradually came off, gradually amassed ground, gradually got bigger, a bit more, gradually got up, this sort of thing. Jericho, which is the first big conquest you hear of in the account of Joshua and the conquering of Canaan, is actually quite a long way from the desert. And you would find that, you would expect that unless you had a modern army with means of communication and transport and supplies and all that, it would be quite difficult to move that many people. And again, bearing in mind, I'm going to get shot for this, I know, but the numbers, when you read about the numbers of people who came out of Egypt, they're grossly magnified. The whole region would not have supported some of the numbers that the Israelites are reckoned to be. Millions of people, it's just not right. And so the Israelites would not have been able to just come off the land and take over everybody. So when they did finally settle into the land and start building their own settlements and tribal areas, they were basically moving in on other peoples. And presumably, because they were better fighters than the other people. The other people gave way, seceded the land, this sort of thing. And the Hittites would have been some of those people. At the time of the empire's height, the Hittite army was one of the most disciplined armies the world knew. It could beat Egypt, and Egypt was no easy thing. It beat Assyria. It didn't beat Egypt all the way into the ground, as witnessed the peace treaty. But it certainly knocked Assyria, the whole of this, the Assyrian empire became a vassal state to the Hittites. So they were forced to be reckoned with. So by the time the Israelites had got all the way into Canaan, the Hittites were still there, still occupying parts of the area, still raising their families and building their houses, and probably getting on with, judging by the remarks that Uriah was a Hittite but a general in David's army, and there's various others mentioned who are, part of the Israel story, the old stories. So it's conceivable that the Hittites just gradually merged into that Israelite area, and over the centuries just became part of it. But they were a distinct and very, very formidable empire at one stage. Okay? And so they go. That's the Hittites. Next week, we'll be talking about the Jebusites. So you can look up your Bible dictionaries or whatever and try and figure out who they were. And there's a clue, because you look at the name, it should be a giveaway as to who the Jebusites were. And they're a fairly interesting group too. So until next week then, I leave you with that task. Get your Bibles out, see if you can find out what you can about the Jebusites. Then you'll know as much as I do, or more perhaps. In either event, good night, God bless.